Good afternoon, everyone. It is now 12 o'clock. We'll give it a couple more minutes and then we'll get started talking about replication and redundancy. Okay, everyone, it is 12:02, so we'll go ahead and get started. This is Rob Foster. I am the ACM sales engineer for the Central Region. I want to thank everybody for joining today. Kind of the same format that we've been utilizing for the previous Lunch and Learns. I'll go through a presentation, then I'm going to launch into a demo, and then at the conclusion of the demo, we're going to open the floor up to questions. Feel free to ask those, come off mute and ask those verbally, or as always, you can submit your questions in the chat. And feel free to submit your questions in the chat anytime during the presentation as well. So with that being said, today we're going to talk about replication and redundancy. We're going to go in depth, and again, I'm going to go through a demonstration of setting up both replication and redundancy or failover. Okay, so just some of the objectives today. We're going to talk about the different types of replication and redundancy. We're going to talk about the requirements for setting up replication and redundancy. And I do want to spend some time talking about the difference between merge and synchronize. This is a very important distinction. This comes up a lot, and I'll go into that in more depth when we get to that. And I'm going to pass along some tips and reminders for when you do set up replication or redundancy. Okay, so let's talk about types of replication and redundancy. So let's start with replication. So you can have a system that is just, or you could have two systems rather, or more, that just have replication configured between the two of them and not auto failover or even manual failover. So replication is just simply copying the LDAP configuration database from one appliance to another and then synchronizing changes between those two databases. So if you make a change on one ACM system, that change is going to synchronize to the other ACM system or systems. Typically, applications where you would just use replication only would be, to extend beyond the limits of a single appliance. So the typical limits that people hit are listed here on the presentation, and that is 2,048 doors. So when you get to that 2,049th door, you would need to add a second appliance. Also, the 512 controller limit. This comes up especially if you're using 1501s at every door. Nice thing about a 1501, it is PoE and you're able to take network out to the door and power everything, but one of the drawbacks is a 1501 is a controller. So you can hit that controller limit pretty quick. Not a problem. We can go beyond 512 controllers. We would just add a second appliance and then we would configure replication between the two. So now let's talk about redundancy. Now, replication is a part of redundancy, so keep that in mind. But with redundancy, or failover as we call it, this allows you to set up a standby appliance to take over when your primary appliance fails. So unlike just standard replication, the standby appliance is just waiting there. It's not managing any hardware or any users. The changes that are made on the primary appliance are being replicated to the secondary appliance in preparation for, should it need to take over for the primary appliance. Now, applications where you would use failover, this is going to be critical in environments where, uptime is essential. That those type of environments can't wait for a new appliance to arrive and backups to be restored. They have to be able to resume operation, in a matter of minutes. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about replication. So as I mentioned before, when you have two appliances or even more, you're not limited to only two appliances. You could do up to 9 appliances and replicate those. When you do that, you make changes, or if you make a change on one of the appliances, it's going to replicate to the other. Now, one important distinction is with replication, this is only replicating changes made to the configuration database. This is not replicating changes made to the transaction databases. So each of your ACM appliances would maintain their own transaction database. So any hardware connected to each of those servers are going to report to that specific server, and those transactions will be logged there. Now, one of the things that I want to note is, even though the configuration databases are synchronized between the two systems, you're not going to see the hardware status or be able to change the hardware configuration on the server where the hardware is not connected. So keep that in mind. Even though that configuration is there, you can't make changes to it. You have to go to the appliance where the hardware is connected to actually make changes. So one final note, if you do have more than 2 appliances, a star topology is recommended. As you can see here, you'll see that one is essentially the primary appliance, and then changes made to the appliance there in the middle would be replicated out to the appliances on the edge. So let's talk about licensing. So now pay especially close attention to this, because the requirements here are different for when you're just doing replication versus doing failover. There's some very important distinctions. So let's just start with replication. There is a license required that's listed there at the top. That license is required on each appliance that will be used for replication. Now, one thing to note, this is different than failover, is when you are doing replication only, the appliances do not have to have the same licensing. So here's an example. This might be the case where you've used 1501s at every door. You've reached that 512 max controller limit, so you've decided to add a second appliance. Now, on your first appliance, you had LDAP collaboration set up. So when you add that second appliance, you don't have to add that LDAP collaboration to that second appliance, because when the LDAP information comes in on the primary appliance, or primary 1, as I have it listed here, those changes will synchronize through replication over to primary 2 appliance. So you can see that also I don't have to have the same number of reader licenses on the primary 2 appliance. I just have to have the reader licenses to support the doors that will be connected to that appliance. Now, this is different when we get to failover, and you will see that when we get to the actual licensing for a failover scenario. Okay, So let's talk about failover. Now, redundancy or replication, I should say, is a part of redundancy and failover, but we take it a step further. So a few different types of failover. I'll start with automatic failover. Of course, in this scenario, you have a standby appliance that's monitoring the health of the primary appliance. And if that primary appliance becomes unresponsive, then the standby appliance will automatically take over for the primary appliance. So that's one option. The other option, if you don't want to use automatic failover, you can use manual failover. And this would require intervention of the ACM operator to actually fail over. Also keep in mind, if you are using automatic failover, you can still manually fail over and fail back as needed. So if you do an upgrade, typically you would upgrade the primary appliance, or you would fail over to the secondary appliance first. You would do the upgrade on the primary appliance. And then once that comes back online, you would manually fail back to that primary appliance and then do the upgrade on the secondary appliance. So as I mentioned, failover uses replication to synchronize configuration changes from one appliance to another. And also, in the case of redundancy and failover, the transaction databases are also synchronized between the primary and standby appliances. Now, I say standby appliances, plural, because you can have more than one standby appliance. Now, but one important distinction is that each primary appliance can only have one standby appliance assigned to it. But a standby appliance can be assigned to more than one primary appliance. But it can only resume operations for one primary server or appliance at a time. So just a reminder, a standby appliance is just that. It's standing by waiting to take over for the primary. So it's not managing any hardware, no controllers are connected to it. It's really not doing anything, but just standing by waiting to take over should the primary fail. So let's talk about failover licensing requirements. You'll see that the license number that I have listed there in the description of the license, it says that it includes the replication license. So that's part of the auto failover license. You don't need to include the replication license as well, since it is included with the failover license. Now, one thing I do want to point out here is that in the case of failover, your standby server must be licensed separately. So it has to have at least the same licenses as the primary server. So if you have two servers, a good rule of thumb is the primary appliance and the secondary appliance should have the exact same licensing. So you see my example here. I've got a primary appliance with 32 doors. It has badging, it has LDAP collaboration, and it has failover. Now you'll notice, unlike my replication example, where we were just using replication only, and we just had to have LDAP on one of the servers, in the case of auto failover, since that secondary appliance is actually taking over operations for that primary appliance, it has to have all the same licenses as the primary appliance. So you'll see here in the example, the licenses are exactly the same on both appliances. Okay, so a lot of the requirements, a lot of the technical requirements for setting up replication and redundancy are the same. So I've kind of combined them into one section here. And just a reminder, licensing, very important. You're not going to get very far with replication and redundancy if you don't purchase the correct licenses. So of course you can go back on the previous slides and review those. Now, also it's important to remember that when you do actually get into ACM and set up replication and possibly failover, you must use the system administrator account. It doesn't matter if you have created another account and it's a member of the super admin role, it has to be configured with the system administrator account. Another important distinction here, clients must be able to connect to each other by host name. So you need to make sure that you configure a name server on both appliances. Ideally, it should be the same name server. There's some additional tips I have on that in a later slide. Also, timing is very important on appliances. So when synchronization occurs between the two appliances, it uses the timestamp to determine what the most recent record is. So if you have one appliance that's a minute or two off, you're going to start having synchronization errors. So definitely want to use the same NTP time server source as well on both appliances. Now, you're going to have some additional communication ports that are needed when you do set up replication and redundancy. Just remember, these ports have to be open between the two appliances to allow them to communicate. Your web service port typically is port 443, but as you all probably know, you can change this. You don't have to use the default port of 443. You'll see in my example that I actually use a different port. You're going to have to configure the LDAP Connect port. You typically don't configure this unless you're doing replication or failover. Got an event replication port. Again, that'll have to be configured, as well as a replication redundancy port. All these are TCP ports. Where the default is none, you can specify a port. Just obviously make sure it's not currently in use on one of the two appliances. So one thing to consider too is when you are configuring two or more appliances to replicate each other, or even a failover system, designate one of the appliances as the primary appliance, where you'll do the majority of your system configurations. Now, let's talk about merge versus synchronize. And the reason I wanted to spend some time on this today is because I get a lot of questions about this. And unfortunately, I get contacted a lot when maybe that individual has gone down the wrong path, and it's going to result in them having to do a lot of reconfiguration. So let's talk about that. There is, just want to be very clear, there is no merge feature included with ACM replication. So what that means is if you've deployed two separate ACM systems, maybe you had a customer that wanted a separate server at each site. Then the customer decides, that's a little bit cumbersome to add, a person to both databases. I'd like those servers to function as one. Oftentimes I get contacted, people will ask me, well, couldn't I just do replication? Yes, you can do replication between the two servers, but it will not merge the information into one database. So what happens is, in that scenario, when you set up replication, you'll set up a subscription. And what happens is, what you'll do is you'll set up the subscription on the secondary appliance. And it will basically, when that starts, it will copy the configuration database from the primary server over to the secondary. So if you've already deployed these two servers and they both have their own hardware and their own identities on the system, it will overwrite those identities and door configurations, access groups, all that stuff will get overwritten. So there is no merge feature with ACM. Now, there is the capability to synchronize. So the difference with synchronize is you start out with the same database on both systems. When you start out with the same database, then you just synchronize changes that were made. So you could make a change on the secondary, it would synchronize to the primary, and vice versa. So very important distinction. If you decide to merge or decide to set up replication between two existing servers that each have their own hardware configured, you're going to have to erase one of those servers and reconfigure, the hardware, the identities, any schedules, anything else that was on that server previously. So I'm going to run through some tips and reminders. Ideally, replication, redundancy, or failover should be set up before adding any controllers, doors, or identities, etc. This is not absolutely required. Obviously, if you have an existing server and if your customer decides they want to add failover, then you're going to have to go ahead and set up failover, even though you have existing doors and identities and so on and so forth. Now, the reason we say that is because if you set up the subscription, the wrong way, then you're going to overwrite your database. In the case of if you set it up the wrong way and you had just added a new server and you set up the subscription on the primary instead of the secondary, you would basically erase your primary database with the blank database coming from the secondary. So just be very careful. One of the things, or one of the suggestions I make when consulting with you all about setting up replication or failover is use the replication guide and follow it exactly. You'll notice in the handouts you can download the replication redundancy guide. Anytime I set it up, and I've set it up multiple times, I always get this guide out and I always follow it. So definitely do that. Now, one of the things that I mentioned on a previous slide is that your appliances need to be able to connect to each other based on host name versus just IP address. One of the things I have found is that when you set the host name on ACM, it's a good idea to use the fully qualified domain name versus just the network name. The reason that is because there's no easy way to add DNS suffixes to the search order in the appliancesresolve.conf file. So to avoid that issue, just go ahead and use the fully qualified domain name for the host name. And you'll see that in the demo when I go through the configuration. Also, I would highly recommend using the same name server or DNS server and time server addresses on both of your appliances. And if you have multiple appliances, use the same across all appliances. Now, another important distinction to keep in mind, because this is different from how some other solutions do failover and redundancy. The appliances here, regardless of whether they're a standby appliance or a standby appliance that takes over for a primary appliance or whatever, those appliances will always maintain their own host name and IP address. So keep that in mind as we go forward here. And finally, redundancy and failover is not a replacement for configuration and transaction backups. Though unlikely, if you do have some type of database corruption occur on one appliance, it's very likely that that corruption would get synchronized to the other appliance. And now you have two appliances that have corruption. So obviously, if you don't have a backup, it would be very difficult to recover from that. So don't forget to run your backups. Failover is another layer in your disaster recovery plan. It's not a replacement for backups. Okay, with that being said, we'll transition over to the configuration demo. But before I do that, I want to launch a poll here, if you all don't mind answering questions there as I set up the demo here. And again, I appreciate you all answering those questions. It's very good feedback for us on how we can improve our solutions. So thank you all again for doing that. Okay, we'll get the poll here. A little bit more time. So it looks like the majority of you have not deployed replication or redundancy. So we'll have some other questions that kind of drill down into that as we go through the presentation. I'll go ahead and give it another minute, or probably about another 15 seconds. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll now. And I'm going to go ahead and do one more poll question before we start the configuration demo. If y'all don't mind answering this question as well. Okay, we'll give it another 15 seconds here. Interesting responses there. So we'll give it another 10 seconds here, and then I'm going to close that poll and jump into the demo portion. Hopefully nobody's timing me on the 10 seconds because I'm definitely not using a stopwatch here. So I'm going to go ahead and close this poll now, and we'll jump into the demo. So hopefully you all can see that I have a web browser opened up. You know, in the first tab, I have one ACM appliance that I'm connected to. In the second tab, I have a second appliance that I'm connected to. The first tab is going to be my primary server. So we're going to start there with the configuration. When we're going to flip-flop between the two servers, but so it's a good idea when you set this up to go ahead and open both. Just obviously open the second appliance in a separate tab. Now you're going to see here I'm going to log in with the admin account since I have to configure replication and failover with the admin account. So I'm going to go ahead and log in. Now I've gone ahead and configured everything in my system. So there might be a couple things that look a little bit different since it's already configured, but I'll try to point those out as I go through. After replication's configured, when you go to setup and settings and you go to appliance, you get an option to look either connect to the configuration of the primary, or you can view the configuration of the other server. Can't make any changes. You know, in this case, my secondary server is labeled ACM secondary. If I were to open this up, even though I'm on the primary server, I'm going to get this message that I can only view the configuration information. I would actually have to connect to that physical appliance to make any changes to these settings. Okay, so let's go back. We're just going to go ahead and look at the primary appliance, since that's where we're going to start our configuration. So just looking down through here, obviously we have to have a host name. And you can see here that I've used the fully qualified domain name for my host name. This, again, it makes it easier. I've configured a DNS entry for this server. But if you use a fully qualified domain name, it has a lot easier time resolving that IP address. Now, my name server, I've got it configured here, and I have obviously the time server configured here as well. When we go to the secondary, you'll see that these settings are the same on the secondary as they are on the primary here. Now, in my case, I'm not using the default web server port. I'm using port 10,001, which is fine. It's not a problem. You just have to note this when you actually go to set up replication. And finally, typically, you do not have the LDAP connect port specified before you set up replication. So make sure you specify an unused port. I've used TCP port 15,000 here. Of course, you can use a different port if you'd like. So once we've done this, we would go over after you make this change here, you'll have to reboot the server. But while you're waiting for the server to come back up, you could go over to the secondary. Again, I'm logging in with the admin account. I'm going to go to setup and settings and then down to the appliance. And again, you won't have these two choices until replication is set up. But in my case, I've already set it up. So I'm seeing these two choices. A good way to remember if you forget which server you're connected to, just keep in mind that the server you're not currently on will have this delete option here. So you can't delete yourself. So that's a good indicator. If it doesn't have the delete sign, that's the server you're currently on. So we'll go over here. We'll see that our settings match, other than the host name and of course appliance name are different. Again, use the fully qualified domain name, use the same DNS and time server, and I went down and specified my LDAP Connect port, which is 15,000. Again, it doesn't matter what port you use, just make sure it's not currently in use and that you use the same port on all the appliances. So once you've done that, we can go back to the primary appliance and we can set up the replication portion. So I'm going to transition over here to the primary appliance. I'm still logged in. Now that I'm here, I'm going to go to the replication tab. So first thing you're going to want to do is you're going to enable replication. And it's a good idea to enable encryption. That way the synchronization between the two servers are encrypted. You don't have anything sent in clear text. So the next piece you'll come to is you'll need to specify an address that will be used, as far as replication is concerned. It needs to be unique. Typically on the primary server, you would start with address 1, and then continue the numbering from there. Identity password, you're going to want to use the admin password here, same one that you logged in with, and then you will have to specify an event replication port. Again, this is the number I chose. I believe this is the number that's in the replication guide. It doesn't have to be this number, but just for ease of use and troubleshooting later, I like to use the port numbers that are in the actual configuration guide, unless that port's already in use for some other reason. So once you configure this, I would leave the rest of these values at their default, unless there's a compelling reason to change it. I would start with these settings. Then if there's issues and you're working with tech support, they may direct you to change some of these values. Now, once you configure this section here, you're going to go back to the secondary appliance and configure the same thing. So right now in the configuration process, you would not see anything listed here under replication subscriptions. So we'll go over to the secondary appliance. Again, I'm still logged in. I'm going to go to the replication tab, and I'm going to set up the same thing under replication settings that I set up on the primary. The only thing that's going to be different is the address. In this case, I'm going to use address 2. Everything else remains the same. I need to make sure I use the same event replication port that I used on the primary. I'm going to accept these defaults. And now that I've enabled replication, I need to create a subscription. Now this is where you have to be very, very careful. This step, actually, I would, at this point, I would pause. I would take a look at the replication guide. I would reread this section, make sure I'm 100% clear on what needs to be done here. Also, as a reminder, before you set up replication, it would be a good idea to take a backup of both systems in case you do make a mistake and you need to restore the system. So definitely keep that in mind. So I'm on the secondary server and I want to set up a replication or set up a replication subscription to the primary server. because what I want to do is I want to grab the database from the primary server, the configuration database in this case, and I want to pull it over to the secondary. And I'm going to overwrite whatever configuration I have on the secondary appliance, with the exception of IP address, host name, and things like that that have to be unique on the secondary appliance. Everything else is going to get overwritten with the configuration database from the master. So on the secondary, I'm going to go to Replication Subscriptions. I'm going to click on New, and then I'm going to get these options here. So I'm going to specify the host name. In this case, I use the fully qualified domain name. I need to specify the web port of my primary appliance. I'm on the secondary, so it's different. It's 10,002. I need to put the web port of the primary, which is 10,001. Need to specify the LDAP port, and then I'm going to use my admin account and my admin password. I'm then going to save my results. This will actually flip to another screen that'll give you the status of the replication setup. And once that's complete, you'll get an option to continue. So once that's complete, you'll see information appear here that indicates that the replication has been set up to the primary and the secondary, and you'll get entries here that indicate that the replication was set up successfully. And now when you go back to the primary, you will see that a subscription was automatically created to the secondary. I didn't have to do this configuration here. This automatically appeared. But make sure, it's very important, that you don't set up a subscription here. You want to set it up on the secondary. And again, here I can see that my two servers are communicating. Now, once you have replication set up, it's a good idea to test to make sure that things are in fact replicating from one server to another. So I'll start at the primary. I'm going to go in. I'm just going to add an identity. So let's search here. I'm just going to use we'll just use test identity. So we'll call this test. I'm going to put the word primary here just so I know where I set this up from. I'm going to save this. I'm not going to worry about roles or tokens or anything else. I just want to see if that identity information goes over to the secondary. So now I'm going to go over here to the secondary server. I'm going to go to identities. And look, it's test primary identity has shown up over on the secondary. So you can see the replication happens pretty quick. I'm going to add a second account. Let me make sure it's not already on the primary either. I'm going to do another test account, and I'll call it test secondary. And I'm going to set it up on the secondary and make sure it actually synchronizes over to the primary. So let's do that. Okay. We'll click, oh, sorry, my browser auto-filled in that information. Let me remove that real quick. Okay. So now we can go back to the primary. Let's see if the information from the secondary came over. And it did. So we're seeing synchronization from the primary to the secondary and vice versa, from the secondary back to the primary. So now we know we've got replication configured correctly. Now, if you were just setting up replication, maybe it's a scenario where you're at that 249th door, then you're done. You don't have to configure anything else. Replication's up and running. But if you are going to be setting up failover, then we do have some additional steps. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and because I'm really bad about forgetting to do these polls. I'm going to put one more poll up here while I transition to setting up auto failover. If you all wouldn't mind answering this. Okay, about another 10 seconds and we're going to close that poll. Okay, close that poll. Then I have one final poll question, if you all don't mind answering this one as well. I'll go ahead and distribute that now. So interesting on this poll that I'm seeing about 65 to 70% talk about cost being a barrier to deploying, redundancy, auto failover. One thing I would encourage you to do is look at the cost of our replication feature. You can contact your RSM and compare that to the cost of some of the other auto failover and replication software packages out there. I think you'll see that the ACM option that we do within the ACM software is much more affordable than some of those third-party solutions out there. I can remember quoting some of those solutions in my past life, and price tag going north of $50,000. You're not anywhere near that with doing the auto failover within ACM. So yeah, if you're definitely looking at that, reach out to your RSM. They can give you accurate pricing, of what it would take to deploy in your environment. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close this last poll. Again, thank you all for participating. And we're going to, so we've set up replication. So now we're going to take the next step and we're going to set up auto failover. Now, before you can set up auto failover, you have to have replication set up. So we've completed that. We've met that criteria. The next thing you're going to want to do is you're going to want to log into the secondary, and you're going to want to designate this as a hot standby server. Now, this server is already set as hot standby, and it's grayed out because it's currently configured as a hot standby on the primary. But before it's configured on the primary, this option would not be grayed out. So you'd want to select that. Now the server will show up as a standby option on the primary. So let's go back over to the primary now. And we're going to go to replication. Now we're going to skip down to the bottom of the replication tab to the failover setting. Now, if you had more than one standby appliance, they would obviously appear in this list. If you had an environment where you had, maybe 3 different servers that are configured to replicate to each other, and then each of those servers had a failover appliance, and obviously you'd see more than one server listed here. So you're going to select your, select your secondary appliance or standby appliance. You're going to specify the port. This is the port that it's going to use to monitor the primary appliance, or the secondary will use to monitor the primary appliance. It's going to check for the secondary is going to check to see that the primary is online every 30 seconds. And if it doesn't get a response, it's going to check again. It's going to check 2 more times, and then it's going to consider that server to have failed. And in this case, I'm going to have it automatically fail over. Now, if I didn't want it to automatically fail over, if I wanted this to be a manual failover process, I would simply uncheck the monitor on box. And then I would just basically handle the failover from the standby server. But in this case, I want it to automatically fail over. So now, if you wanted to initiate a failover manually, you would need to go to the secondary appliance. So let's go there. We'll go to Replication, and we'll scroll down to Failover Settings. You'll see that it's currently not active, so it's in standby mode, and I have the option to take over. So I'm going to go ahead and take over. This does take a little bit of time for everything to fail over. One thing you'll notice real quick, see if I can catch it before it fails over. Oh, too late. Okay, we'll catch it when we fail it back. So when a server is not, or is in standby mode and it's not active, now the primary is in standby mode, you're not going to have anything listed here under panels because you can't interact with the panels if they're not currently connected to your server. So the configuration is still there. It's still in the database. It's just not being presented to you here. So let's go back to the secondary appliance. You can see that now the secondary appliance is active, and you have the option to fail back. So if you were doing a software update or something like that, that might be another application where you might want to manually fail over an appliance, or maybe you just want to test it, make sure everything comes up correctly. So I'm going to leave this as primary. The secondary is now functioning as the primary. We're going to go over and look at our panels. We're going to see that our panel that I had online on the primary is currently connected. Now I can look at this panel and interact with this panel. Now, if I go back, if I want to fail this back to the primary, I would go back to my Replication tab, and I would select Fail Back. Now, we'll give this a moment. Let's see, the panels are probably, yep, okay. So now let's go over to the primary. We should see our panel appear here shortly. And my panels are configured in, as IP server. So in this case, the ACM server is making the connection to the panel. So right now the primary is contacting, this case, EP1501. And once it makes the connection, we'll get a update for device status. One other thing I want to point out before we jump into questions here, just turn on my emulator. So we talked about replication synchronization happening between the configuration database and or between the two configuration databases rather. Now also in failover, you have the transaction databases being synchronized. So right now you'll see events coming in. Again, I'm on the primary, and we have fallen back to the primary. You'll see that we have events coming in, transactions coming in. Now, if you go look at the secondary, because it's in standby mode, you're not going to see these transactions and events. So you see, you're not seeing anything happening here. This is all older stuff from before we failed back. Now, if you go to reports, you can see that the data has been synchronized. So if I go to transaction report on the secondary, I could find the transactions that are occurring on the primary that have been synchronized over. I have to give it a little bit more time for it to synchronize over. But you'll see these events. They're still in the database, even though you're not seeing them fly by, you know, at events. Okay, with that being said, let's open it up to questions. Let me open up my questions here and let's see what we have answered.
Hey, Rob, I answered most of them, but you might want to go. So here's some interesting ones, right? So Jeff is asking, actually, Rob is asking, what is actually replicated? What information are we replicating? So users, right? So identities, roles, collaboration, physical hardware, policies, and settings.
Perfect. Thanks, Francisco. Do we have any other ones that haven't been answered?
Interesting comment. Customers don't think they need replication until they do.
Yeah, definitely. You know, and I think the cost is sometimes a barrier. You know, as we saw in the poll results. You know, especially if you looked at you know, failover options with other solutions that require a third-party solution. Those are really expensive, and I think that's probably you know, a lot of customers have looked at that and said, well, yeah, maybe I will be okay if I'm down for a couple of days because the, you know, controllers will still let people in. You know, I won't see any alarms, but you know, I'm okay with that. But if they look at the cost of how much it is, you know, ACM compared to other solutions, I think it's a little bit more obtainable. So I think that's one of the barriers that we see out there.
No doubt. There's one last question that if you want to take, so you can, it's a good one for you to, you know, say the question and the answer there.
Let's see here. For a security device like the ACM, most of my prospects and customers would be real concerned about this being a cloud-only option. Given the reality of disaster planning and response in today's world, but having a cloud backup redundancy capability for even the eventual disk fails. Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's yeah, I mean, it makes a lot of sense. It's not, you know, terribly expensive. It's not cost prohibitive like it's been in the past. So yeah, thanks for the feedback and thanks for the comments from everyone. Any other questions? Comments? Okay. Well, if there's, oh, go ahead. Sorry. Was there another question?
Yeah. So here's a question for you. I'm still not seeing the difference between replication and failover. I thought replication keeps the hardware, the server in control.
So replication is just synchronizing the configuration databases. So you could have two servers that are replicating between each other. And basically, it could be a situation where, you know, in the case of maybe you're at that 249th door and you have to add another appliance. So you add that second appliance, take care of that you know, first door, but you need to be able to synchronize the configuration information between the two servers. Now, if one of those servers fails, the other one doesn't take over for it. So that's where you would just use replication. Now, if you had that same case, maybe you have those two servers and the customer does want failover. They want, if one of those servers, goes down, they want another server to take its place. That's where you would add a third, possibly fourth server that could act as a standby server for either of those first two servers if they should go down. And so replication is also required with failover to synchronize the configuration database changes, because obviously if the standby server has to take over for the primary, it needs to have the configuration to do so.
Good one. Thanks for the question, Rob. Couple other comments in here. Josh, I put that on the comment in there. He's asking for some information on replication. Just get in contact with us, with the sales engineer personnel in your area for ACM, and we'll be glad to help you with that. Okay. Thanks, Stephen. Jeff, thanks that as well.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you all for joining. So with that being said, Jared, are you still on? You want to talk about your session on Friday?
So the session on Friday, I don't think Jared's online. So the session on Friday will be an Active Directory. For folks on the call here, please try to join us. It's probably one of the hottest features that customers ask us, is how you integrate ACM with Active Directory to two things, right? One is to remote authenticate that user logging in ACM, and how do I bring information from Active Directory into ACM cardholders, okay? So join us on Friday for that. We'll be covering that on Friday, noon Pacific time, okay? This Friday at noon Pacific time will be Active Directory. Then Monday of next week will be with me, Francisco. Will be noon Eastern, next Monday, noon Eastern. And we're going to cover policies and groups and profiles. So this is how do you mass update information in ACM. So please join us on those sessions. There's some great material for you to go see. All right, that's it for me.
Awesome. Thanks, Francisco. And if there's no other questions, we'll go ahead and conclude. I'll give you 2 minutes of your lives back. Thanks again for joining. Join us again on Friday, and everyone have a great afternoon. Thanks.